It's August of 1914, and war had just broken out in Europe after Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated on June 28, 1914. This set off a chain of events that sparked the beginning of what would be known as the First World War. Just over a month later, on August 4, 1914, Great Britain officially declared war on Germany after they refused to remove troops from neutral Belgium. While fought thousands of miles away, the United States was playing a vital role in supplying the Allies for the war effort. And the Great Lakes' role in America's steel production would not only play a role in the First World War, but also in the Second World War a few decades later. Ever since iron ore was discovered in Michigan's Upper Peninsula in the mid-19th century, the Great Lakes have played an important role in America's steel production. By the turn of the 20th century, America could produce more than 10 million tons of steel a year, and by 1910, it was more than 24 million tons a year. Not only is steel used to build ships, but it is also used to construct buildings, bridges, automobiles, almost everything that we use in our everyday lives. It's even more useful in wartime. The steel is used to construct warships, tanks, aircraft, and other weapons of war. Although America's steel production is not the only resource for war from the Great Lakes region. The area has millions of acres of farmland across all the states that border the lakes and Ontario. And even today, most of the crops from the Great Lakes region are sent overseas to areas where conflict is taking place. Although this isn't the first time the Great Lakes have supplied other countries at war with weapons and other war materials for the battlefields. When the First World War began in August of 1914, the United States did its best to stay out of the war while also supplying the Allies in the war effort. However, not long after the war had broken out, Germany had introduced a brand new weapon, the U-boat. A U-boat is a submarine that is designed to hunt down enemy warships and merchant vessels and sink them by firing one or more torpedoes at that ship. U-boats from the First World War aren't very fast. They can only travel about 9 knots submerged, and at their max, 15 knots surfaced. But they can fire torpedoes that can travel through the water faster than most ships of that time. First, the U-boat has to get ahead of the ship it's going to attack. The crew prepares the torpedo for launch, and when the ship is within range of the attack, the torpedo is launched and it races toward the ship. And when it makes contact with the hull of the ship, the torpedo explodes and the ship takes damage. Though this wasn't the U-boat's only weapon, most U-boats were equipped with large deck guns to attack smaller ships from a shorter distance. It's estimated that over the course of the First World War, these U-boats have sunk over 5,000 ships, and less than 200 U-boats were ever lost during the war. However, one U-boat attack would play a role in the U.S. entering the war. After the war broke out, many of Britain's large ocean liners were laid up because the Admiralty didn't see a need for them yet. However, a couple of them remained in service transporting passengers across the North Atlantic. One of those ships was the RMS Lusitania, one of Britain's 4-funneled ocean liners. When she and her sister ship, the RMS Mauretania, entered service in 1907, they were both the largest and fastest ships in the world at that time. They both could cross the Atlantic in about 5 days. But when the war broke out, the British military needed coal for the warships and other military vehicles, and the Lusitania had to go slower in order to save coal. Her top speed was reduced from 26 knots to 21 knots, and her 5-day crossing was extended to 7 days. On top of that, she was only allowed to do the crossing once a month, and while the Mauretania was laid up in Liverpool, the Lusitania continued her service as an ocean liner. On May 1, 1915, about 9 months after the war began, the Lusitania departed New York Harbor bound for Liverpool with nearly 2,000 passengers and crew aboard. But little did the passengers know that on the other side of the Atlantic, thousands of miles away, the German U-boat U-20 had left port and was heading towards the Celtic Sea, the same area in which the Lusitania would be sailing through a few days later. On May 7th, 6 days later, the Lusitania was steaming about 10 miles off the coast of Ireland when she came in the perfect range for U-20 to fire a torpedo at the ship. In fact, the previous day, the U-20 had sunk 2 other ships off the coast of Ireland. Anyway, the torpedoes struck the ship in between the first and second funnels, which left a huge amount of damage in the hull of the ship. The ship sank in 18 minutes, and out of the 1,962 people on board, only 765 survived the sinking. Following the disaster, many people were outraged as to why Germany would sink a civilian ship, and over the next few decades, the sinking of the Lusitania would become quite controversial. While it wasn't the primary reason, the sinking of the Lusitania was one of the 4 main reasons that the U.S. entered the war 2 years later. Finally, in 1917, the United States, led by President Woodrow Wilson, entered the First World War with Britain against Germany, and it was during this time that more warships, tanks, and aircraft were being constructed for the war effort. And this is where the Great Lakes come into play. After America declared war on Germany, both the U.S. and Britain began to requisition some of their ocean liners and other merchant vessels to use as both troop ships and hospital ships. Also at that time, more warships such as destroyers, cruisers, and battleships were being constructed, and some of them were actually built in shipyards on the Great Lakes. On top of that, more tanks, aircraft, and other military vehicles were being created at a high rate. And of course, most of them were created using steel. And this is when Great Lakes shipping companies began to step up their game, transporting more iron ore, limestone, grain, and more to the steel mills and factories, in which the steel went towards creating ships, tanks, aircraft, and other military vehicles. And the produce from the farms in the region was sent to the military, which they still do to this day. In November of 1918, the First World War had finally come to an end, and luckily the U.S., Britain, and France had won the First World War, and Germany had to pay the Allies war reparations. After the war had ended, the demand for steel in the military had decreased, although Great Lakes steel was still used to build skyscrapers, bridges, automobiles, and other structures built nationwide in the 1920s and 30s. However, rising tensions in the 1930s would result in another worldwide conflict that would increase the demand for Great Lakes steel. In September of 1939, after several years of rising tensions in Europe, Germany had invaded Poland, and shortly after, Britain and France had declared war on Nazi Germany, sparking what would become known as the Second World War. Just like with the First World War, the United States did its best to stay out of the conflict going on in Europe, while also supplying the Allies in the war effort. And it was during this time when Allied merchant ships were being attacked and sunk by enemy aircraft, submarines, and warships. It was in late 1940 and early 1941 that the United States, led by President Franklin Roosevelt, devised a plan to construct thousands of hastily built cargo ships that would be able to transport war supplies overseas and help the Allies win the Second World War. These vessels were known as the Liberty ships. They were built in a way where they could be built in a matter of weeks rather than months. The design for these ships dates back to the late 19th century, and most were powered by the outdated reciprocating steam engine, which at that point had been almost fully replaced by the more powerful steam turbine engine. Even some ships on the Great Lakes had started to use the steam turbine engine at that point. Over the span of just a few years, more than 2,700 Liberty-class ships were built. Where it used to take anywhere between 6 months to a year to build a ship of that size, during the Second World War, it took on average only 42 days to build a Liberty ship. 18 shipyards on the U.S. coast were tasked with building these ships. The reason for these ships being built so quickly is because they weren't built like standard vessels of that time. First of all, these ships had welded hulls. At that point, most ships' hulls were built with riveted steel plates, which took time and precision to put together. With welding, skill would not be required. Next, these ships would have many of their components such as the machinery, hull plates, and support structures assembled at different factories, which would then be brought to the shipyard for final construction. By the end of the Second World War, the U.S. would develop more than 2,500 Liberty ships. When they were out at sea, they would travel in large convoys. They were vulnerable, since they couldn't outrun German U-boats. Because of this, the convoys were guarded by destroyer escorts, and the vessels with more vulnerable cargo traveled in the center of the convoy, although hundreds of these ships were sunk and damaged throughout the war. And since these shipyards were building hundreds of these ships, it required a lot of steel. And it was during this time that Great Lakes shipping companies began to step up their game again in bringing as much iron ore and limestone to the steel mills as possible to meet the rising demand. And shipyards on the Great Lakes were also building ships for the war effort. However, the same year the first Liberty ships were built is when the United States officially entered the Second World War. With the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan in December of 1941, the U.S. declared war on the Japanese, and the nation's massive industrial complex was not only used to build the hundreds of Liberty ships, and later the Victory ships, but also to churn out other warships, aircrafts, tanks, and other military vehicles that would destroy Japan's military. And once again, the Great Lakes were in a battle to produce enough steel to construct these vehicles. And it was during the Second World War, a military presence was taking place at the Sioux Locks. This was because they feared the Sioux Locks would be attacked by enemy forces during the war. They set up some underwater nets in the locks that would be able to catch any submarines that try to come through the locks. And they set up large barrage balloons around the locks. Essentially, they were small dirigibles. And the idea is that if an enemy aircraft were to fly over the Sioux Locks, the aircraft would get caught in the cables that the balloons were tied to. Plus, troops were stationed in the Sioux Locks, as well as the vessels on the lakes. By 1944, the United States could produce more steel than the rest of the world combined, which contributed to the United States being able to build military vehicles at a higher rate. Finally, with the end of the Second World War in August of 1945, demand for Great Lakes steel had decreased somewhat, but in recent years the demand has increased again, as the United States and Canada are shipping supplies to countries where conflict is going on. By no means are the Great Lakes useless to the economy. They are more important than most people think, since they supply many different resources that almost every country relies on, and that serve as the lifeblood that keeps the American and Canadian economies alive.